Megan Morris has urged scholars in the humanities to develop a critical proximity to their subject matter, as distinct from the usual critical distance that self-consciously objective scholarship usually strives for. The notion of critical proximity fits well with the approach I've used in some of my fieldwork on coastal reclamations, meaning those places where the land is extended out from the shoreline by dumping soil, rock, and urban waste into relatively shallow near-shore waters until a new artificial land surface emerges. Here I want to treat critical proximity as a method. What I'll do is present a brief account of my fieldwork on the reclamation at Elizabeth Bay in Sydney Harbour, and then discuss the methodological dimension of it. I'll then present something on my fieldwork in Japan, and follow that with some final observations on method. So, Elizabeth Bay. In the 1980s, the inner embayment at Elizabeth Bay was reclaimed by building a curved sandstone wall across the intertidal zone and then filling the space behind it with urban waste material and dredged sediment. My attention centers mainly on the sandstone sea wall that stops the reclamation eroding into a harbour and stops the harbour reclaiming the reclamation. The seawall assembles rectilinear sandstone blocks into an object intended to serve as a boundary and a barrier. It is in keeping with the way colonialism projected a rectangular grid of boundaries across indigenous space, in this case the country of the Gadigal clan. As it played out, however, my involvement with the Elizabeth Bay seawall began to undermine the boundary between myself and the geological, opening a door to my own geosubjectivity. I tended to think of the wall as a static barrier to the sea until one afternoon when I stood at low tide on the narrow strip of beach at the foot of the seawall and saw how quickly the stone blocks were eroding. Although Hawkesbury sandstone has great compressive strength, it weathers quite quickly in a process of disaggregation in which the clays and other minerals that bind together the silica grains in the stone dissolve, leaving the affected grains of sand to fall away. What should always have been obvious to me was that the quartz grains falling from the eroding sandstone were not just accumulating on the beach, they were the beach, which is to say they assimilated themselves with the sand grains already there on the beach. The sandstone blocks that were level with my eyes as I stood on the beach were giving up their substance rapidly on a geological timescale, but too slowly for people like me to normally notice. Witnessing the sandstone's erosion up close, I experienced a small inner lurch as the membrane separating my existence from that of the sandstone gave way. I am at an age in which I can claim a certain amount of duration. I've persisted through time. Yeah. And I can easily see the effects of weathering, erosion, wear and tear on my body. Archaeologically, this weathering has left marks on me that show where I've been and what I've done. Like the sandstone, I'm disaggregating, and perhaps it is that which creates the conditions for me to develop an affinity with the stone. Down at the sea wall, what that little lurch felt like was not a shudder of mortality, but a lurch of recognition. recognition that while the temporality of the stone is vastly different to my own, in terms of decay, the difference is not incommensurable. My relationship with the top of the wall at Elizabeth Bay is actually more intimate than with its seaward face. When I sit on the wall or stand on it, my hands unthinkingly touch and caress its surface and come away with grains of sand attached. Some of these end up in my pockets so that I become an unwitting agent for the wall's further dispersal. I'm also mindful of how in the 1960s and 1970s, gay men used to lean against this wall and stroll along it when the park was a well-known and nighttime cruising site. Matthew Gandhi's 2012 essay on gay cruising in a North London cemetery dwells on the relationality between the act of cruising and the environment in which it takes place. Gandhi says that if cruising is understood as a complex interplay between bodies and space, then a queer reading of space reveals a distributed agency of desire that extends beyond individuals or even multiple human bodies to incorporate non-human nature, inanimate objects, surfaces, and smells. Gandhi describes outdoor cruising as ecological rapture. At Elizabeth Bay, I propose that cruising extended to include the seawall as an agentic entity that not only projected its effects and substance seaward, but also landward to engage the bodies of those who leant against it, sat on it, or to invoke a watery metaphor, cruised along it. And at some point in the wall's 130-year history, iron pegs to support a low railing. The load railing has since been removed. The iron pegs were sunk into holes drilled vertically into the sandstone blocks of the wall's parapet and were cemented in place with mortar. Some of the pegs have rusted badly on the salt air, and in the process of rusting, the iron has expanded, exerting enough pressure to crack the surrounding sandstone, much the way that in other climates water seeps into cracks in rocks and then splits them when it freezes and expands. This small wave of anger I experienced when I first noticed the cracking of the rock was to do with the slow violence done to something I'm fond of by the stupidity or callous indifference of those who penetrated the stone with rust-prone iron. But anger is mixed with fascination at how the iron, the saltpeter, and the stone have formed an alliance to shatter the sandstone blocks and thus weaken the seawall as a hard defense against storm surges that would otherwise flood the park. We have to remember that the reclamation pushes the sea out and that the weight of displaced sea generates an impetus that is directed landward. The sea wants to come back. In the decades and centuries ahead, a struggle to hold the line against the sea's force will become more and more part of the everyday life of people on the coast. Back to the iron pegs. Despite being cut into rectangular blocks and stacked up to make a wall, the sandstone has not been domesticated. It retains an unruly kind of agency, as does the iron of the pegs, an agency that acts in defiance of our intentions for the sea wall. Following with my eyes the cracks in the stone, my face ends up only centimeters from the surface, which begins to attract quizzical looks from other people in the park. But I'm going to leave myself hovering there for while I comment on the methodology here. This is a kind of fieldwork where you get up close and personal with non-human others, including with such non-sentient but still very much alive things such as sandstone and seawater. And my disciplinary background in archaeology draws me towards things in place, towards the materiality of things, their agency and their affectivity in very localized settings. Experience has taught me that unexpected trains of thought are triggered by encountering things and materials up close. On the other hand, I also need to consider the larger meanings, to consider the context of the seaworld, for instance, in today's climate crisis and in the context of the Anthropocene thesis. You could think of this as a kind of a drawing back or away from things to get a critical distance from them. These two movements, drawing towards and drawing away, might seem to exist in a kind of tension and to be spatially and even temporally quite different things. On the one hand, there's the immediacy of encountering things in place and in the field. And on the other hand, there's the place and the time of writing about them at the desk, or the reading you do about them and around them in a library or live on your sofa. But actually, what I find when I stand on the beach, gazing at the surface of the sea wall, with its textures, geological fluidity, and the surrounding smells and sounds flooding into me, is that this provokes thoughts that are coming partly from the things that I have read. It is, in fact, as if everything I've ever read is there with me. The act of writing is there with me as well, in the way that what I've just called trains of thought take the form of words, phrases, and sentences running through my head, which is why it is always useful to have a notebook or a phone handy, because this is where writing begins. In Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, we are drawn to the world in a mutually inclusive relation of folding, simultaneously touched by the world as we touch it. This kind of mutuality, which I've described as an intense attentiveness and openness to things, can be enormously productive for people like us. So let's think of it as a method. And moving to Japan, I'm also doing fieldwork on coastal reclamations and seawalls in Japan, mainly on the island of Honshu. Much of the reclaimed land there provides platforms for industry, and the seawalls that defend them are made of concrete. Because of anthropogenic sea level rise and the increasing intensity of typhoon storm surges, many new seawalls are being constructed in Japan, and the height of many of the existing seawalls is being raised. On Japan's main island of Honshu, for instance, 60% of the coastline is now classified as artificial, which is to say that for the most part it is concrete. Honshu has swapped much of its pre-existing coastline of beaches, sand dune fields and wetlands for reclamations that constitute an ocean of concrete, forming flat platforms for the enactment of contemporary life. Forklifts drive over it, kids bounce boards on it. Millions of people live on this artificial land, turning it into a cultural landscape through the activities of everyday life. And despite the immense destruction that this ocean of concrete has caused to coastal and estuarine ecologies and towns, I'm drawn to the technological perfection of the concrete sea walls. My hands, almost of their own volition, reach out to stroke the flawless surfaces of concrete, which is of a standard you rarely see elsewhere in the world, even in high-end architecture. But close inspection of older concrete seawalls and docks, those built before the current wave of anxiety about sea level rise, show that the concrete is slowly but surely degrading. It is giving up its subsets in response to the action of the waves, or you might say, in conversation with the waves. These concrete walls have often pushed the sea kilometres from the original shoreline, but the sea is pushing back. Observing the slow erosion of the concrete seawall on Mejijima Island in Japan's Seto Inland Sea, I'm reminded again that we are not masters of the materials we assemble. The wall is giving up its particles of cement to the sea, reducing its geologic mass, but acquiring organic mass with the barnacles and other crustaceans and algae that its surface affords purchase. This mutuality in which concrete becomes increasingly of the sea, that is, increasingly of the sea that it displaced, plays out in the slow rhythmic tempo of the rising and falling tide, and the straightening and slackening of mooring ropes and chains that are fixed to eye bolts on the top of the quay. On Mejijima, the new seawall is an artifact in waiting, and while it waits the sea level rise, it also seems to have been absorbed into the fabric of daily life, like a piece of furniture. People lean against it, sit on it, hang fishing nets off it, and use the surface to dry seaweed. I saw a young man reclining full length on it. I sat on the wall myself, facing the other way, to write my rambling notes about how the dividing line or suture between the old and new concrete strata is an archaeological horizon that marks the onset of climate change anxiety in this part of Japan. The notebook, whether analog or digital, is critical to this kind of fieldwork. As Michael Tausig has pointed out, field notebooks are a literary genre in their own right. I find there is a direct line between the words in my notebooks and those that appear in publication. The train of thought that begins in the field, in a notebook, in the moment when you are closest to the material, has, I think, the effect of keeping us true to the material. Field notes save us from developing too much of a critical distance in our work. The notebook can preserve, for example, the experience that occurs when we realize that the things we've been trying to encompass have somehow reached out to encompass us.